Hey, welcome back to Hazmat Ops Training. So you've got your 2024 ERG, but you don't have the practical scenario-based experience that you would really like. Well, that's what we're here to do. In the first episode of this series, we had a fairly easy scenario. This one, we're going to kind of turn the heat up just a little bit, add a little more complexity to the incident. And if you haven't seen our full tutorial, please check that out. You can subscribe to our channel. You can see all of our content, but it's a full cover-to-cover overview of the ERG. Our intent here is for you and your colleagues on your team and your agency to look at some of the things that we're presenting, compare that to your policies, compare it to what the ERG is recommending. I'll bet you find that your policies are already very similar, but this will give you that practical scenario-based experience that you're looking for. So let's get straight to our scenario. You're dispatched to a tractor trailer on the exit ramp of the interstate highway in your response area. This was called in by the driver, who stated that his load shifted and several drums of sodium hydroxide solution are turned over in the front of his 53-foot dry van trailer. On arrival, you meet the driver, who is showing signs of physical and emotional distress. He tells you that he has attempted to upright the drums and has been contaminated with the liquid. It's on his hands, pants, and boots. He tells you that the burning on his skin is getting worse by the minute. The trailer doors are open and the liquid can be seen running from the trailer at a slow drip, but obvious that it has been dripping for a while due to a puddle of liquid formed in the gravel. It appears that the spill has not traveled beyond the shoulder of the exit ramp. The driver tells you where to find the shipping papers in the cab of the truck, and it indicates 2 drums of sodium hydroxide solution, UN 1824, are loaded on the trailer. The remainder of the cargo is non-hazardous freight, mostly in cardboard boxes and on wooden pallets. So first, it's important to discuss what actions your policies allow operations level responders to take and what those limitations are. And that's something that you need to talk about, again, in your team, in your agency, but we want to make sure that we understand for this presentation, for this video, we'll proceed under the assumption that a defensive approach will be taken. Additionally, I want to make sure that we understand that firefighting bunker gear offers very limited protection from both liquid and vapor exposure for a hazardous materials incident. So let's start by looking at the inside cover of the book. So we remember from our tutorial video that our example for our shipping papers is on the inside front cover of the book. Now, you already have a shipping paper. The scenario told you that you have a shipping paper that was available to you. So why do we need to go here? Well, it's good to compare some of the elements that should be on a shipping paper to what you're actually holding in your hand. So this is a good comparison to make sure that you're identifying and you're able to find on the shipping paper what you're looking for. Not all shipping papers are created equal. They may have a little bit different format. They may not be laid out exactly like what you're seeing on the inside cover. So it's just a good comparison and a good reminder. Also at the bottom, we have an example of a placard. And what I didn't tell you in the scenario is that we do have this placard on the side of the trailer. I also didn't tell you that this scenario is based on a real-world scenario that the team that I'm associated with responded to. We've actually seen this a number of times. This is a very common occurrence. Sodium hydroxide is a very commonly transported material. There's a couple of things that I've changed just for the maximizing of the training opportunity here, but this is based on an actual response. So let's look here at our flow chart on page 1 of the book. As with last time, I wanted to really highlight and make sure that we're looking closely at what the book does a really good job of. So right here at the top of the flow chart, you'll see this message: resist rushing in, approach incident from upwind, uphill, and or upstream, stay clear of all spills, vapors, fumes, smoke, and potential hazards. Again, this is a powerful message for any level of responder. These are things that we have to remember. It doesn't matter if we're awareness level responder or we're all the way up to technician and even specialist level responder. These are things that we've got to keep in the forefront. These are basic safety rules of hazmat. So as we look down the flow chart, we've got the 4 questions here, the 4 main questions. Do you know the UN or NAID number? Do you know the name of the material? Do you see a placard or label? Do you see a rail car or road trailer? In our scenario here, the answer to all 4 of these questions is yes. So which one of these tracks do we go down? All right, so let's look at some of our options here. So if we go over to the table of placards on page 9, we have a placard on the side of the trailer. We saw that. So if we go to page 9, we find that placard, we match it up, and it sends us to guide 153. Let's put a pin in that for a second, but just remember guide 153. So if we don't choose that track and we go toward the container or the cargo vessel shape, we find on page 15 the picture of the dry van trailer that we're dealing with. It gives us a description that kind of sort of matches what we're dealing with, but it sends us to guide 111. Again, let's put another pin in that. Is guide 111 where we need to be? So again, if you remember from our tutorial video, the answer to those 2 questions are no. Those are not the tracks that we want to be on. Why? Because they're not the best tracks. They are good tracks if those are the only pieces of information that we had. If we only had a placard, we only can see what the container looks like, then fine, we can go down those tracks. But we have the UNID number and we have the proper shipping name. So let's go down those 2 tracks. And incidentally, it doesn't matter for these 2 pieces of information because the way that the book's set up, we're getting to the same place. The same information exists in the yellow pages and the blue pages. But I would like, before we leave the flow chart here, I would like to remind you that if we have only a placard, if we have only the container shape, but at some point we get that UNID number, at some point we get that proper shipping name, let's don't forget to go back to the flow chart, rerun the flow chart with those 2 pieces of information, because more than likely we're going to get to a better guide. We're going to get to the most appropriate guide if we rerun with that proper shipping name and 4-digit ID number. All right, so again, we had the ID number, we had the proper shipping name, so I chose to go ID number. One of the reasons that I chose to do that is if I go by the proper shipping name, I have the potential to misspell, I have the potential to misread. So if using the 4-digit ID number, I feel a little more comfortable that I'm going to land exactly where I need to land. Now again, just being careful and looking at that proper shipping name, I can compare that in the blue pages. Again, the good news is, regardless of whether we go yellow pages or blue pages, we're going to land the same place. So you see here, the 4-digit ID number 1824 gets us to the orange page guide 154, and then we can confirm that our spelling is correct from our shipping papers sodium hydroxide solution. So we're on guide 154, pages 238 and 239 of the book, but guide number 154. And again, if you've been with us on our other videos, and especially in our tutorial video, we've broken down the guide pages and looked at those pieces and parts very, very directly. I'm not going to do that so much because in this episode, when we answer our questions, we're still going to get there. We're still going to do that. So, but one thing I will point out before we get too far into our questions, up at the top you see the big black banner where it says substances - toxic and or corrosive. That's a big deal for me. This is the first time that the book has told me, hey, this is a big deal. And the reason I say that the book is telling me this is a big deal is one word, and that's toxic. Up until this point, other than the visual on the placard for tissue damage, and you know what I'm talking about, the picture on the placard, other than that, I really haven't seen anything that indicates the harm that can come to someone who's exposed. So again, that really should be like a neon sign for me. The other thing, under the potential hazard section here, you see health is listed first and fire and explosion is listed second. That's a big, big red flag. That's a big indicator for the toxicity of this material. I want us to always remember that. That's something that the book really does well in kind of throwing some of those flags and putting some of that information out in front of us, that if we're used to the book, if we're doing this practical training, if we're rehearsing these incidents before they ever happen, these are some of the things that the book can tell us, and they can give us some really good indicators really, really early in the incident. So let's go to our first question. What are your greatest concerns with this scene? So let's pause the video here and talk in your teams, and if you're watching this alone, you just ponder what your biggest issues here are. What are your greatest concerns for this scene? And we'll come back. You can restart the video once you've talked about it, and we'll talk about what my biggest issues are, and we'll kind of compare those pieces of information. So question one, what are your greatest concerns with this scene? And mine are public protection, and specifically the driver who's exposed to the material. And I'll point us back here to Guide 154. Again, up in the top there, it talks about toxic and or corrosive materials. But right under that, in the potential hazards and in the health subsection, the very first bullet says toxic and or corrosive, inhalation, ingestion, or skin contact with the material may cause severe injury or death. Folks, that's a big deal. That again, that's one of those things that should jump off the page. I've got someone who has been contaminated with this material. He's showing signs of contamination. His skin's irritated. He's agitated. There's a lot going on here, and we need to get to work really, really quickly. Again, this should jump off the page. This is absolutely my top priority. And then secondary to that, and all of this can be addressed very, very quickly, but secondary to that, under the evacuation, under the public safety section, evacuation subheading, you see the immediate precautionary measures. It says isolate the spill or leak area in all directions for at least 50 meters or 150 feet for liquids, 25 meters and 75 feet for solids. So we have a liquid material. We have a sodium hydroxide solution. So we're dealing with 150 feet isolation in all directions. And that's our hot zone. And we haven't talked a lot about hot, warm, and cold. We talked a lot about isolation and evacuation, but that is our hot zone. I want to talk specifically here for just a second about those isolation areas that the book talks about. As a staple, as a constant, if you will, in the ERG, and this has been this way for a number of revisions now, but in the ERG, for our initial isolation distances, there's a constant for solids, liquids, and gases. So for solid materials, 75 feet, liquid materials 150 feet, and gases 330 feet. So again, that's a constant for those solids, liquids, and gases. 75, 150, 330 are the distances that we can program into our head, and we know that when our boots hit the ground and we have a spilled liquid 150 feet in all directions, I may shrink that based on different elements. I may expand that based on different elements. But I know right out of the gate, if I have a liquid spill 150 feet in all directions is my good starting point. That's kind of my thumb rule starting point. The book does a great job with this. You'll see here that I've pulled one of the guides for the gases, and if you jump straight down to the evacuation, isolate spill or leak area for at least 100 meters or 330 feet. So you can see where the book is consistent here with these distances. So my next priority is going to be the stability of this incident. Where's it going? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? What's the expectation there? The leak is concerning to me, but as an ops level responder, there's not a lot I can do about that leak. It's beyond my scope to put on chemical protective clothing, to enter the back of that trailer, to do any type of aggressive spill and leak control. It's outside of my scope as an ops level responder. I just can't do it. But having said that, with some of the other things that I can do, and we'll talk about in a few minutes, in the grand scheme of things, we're not dealing with a lot of product here. We're talking about just over 100 gallons of product. We're sitting on an exit ramp from an interstate. Generally speaking, there's probably not a lot in that 150 feet. Maybe there is. It depends on where we are. But in the scenario that I'm giving you, the general assumption is that there's not a lot in that area, in that 150 foot in all directions. So very manageable for me as an ops level responder when it comes to the spill. What I'm the most worried about is the reactivity. That's what worries me more than anything. So what we need to understand is that we're dealing with a corrosive material. We're dealing with a reactive material. Sodium hydroxide is used in all sectors of the hazmat world. It's a very reactive material, and it's used to make a lot of things. So it's used to kick off reactions. And that's a good thing when we're talking about manufacturing. But when we're talking about this material out of its container when it's not supposed to be, it's still a reactive material. So remember our scenario. We're in the back of a trailer. We've got an enclosed space. We've got a reactive material. And you see here in the guide, it's reactive with wood, paper, oil, clothing, in contact with metals. It's going to potentially create a flammable atmosphere. There's a lot going on with this reaction, and that is very concerning to me. Most of these trailers have wooden floors. They'll have sort of a subframe that's made out of metal. It could be steel, could be aluminum, but in most cases, not all, but in most cases, they do have wooden floors. So this trailer, let's say it's 10 years old. Over that 10-year life of that trailer, what else has been spilled in the back of that trailer? I don't know. Don't have any idea. What may be soaked into that wood? Don't have any idea. What may react with the sodium hydroxide when it's spilled onto that wooden floor? I have no idea. That in and of itself is the problem. I have no idea what kind of reaction's going on in there. And again, first and foremost, I have no business in that trailer as an ops level responder, but I need to monitor that reaction. If that reaction begins to get worse, if it begins to produce lots of heat and potentially starts a fire, that's something I've got to address. So there's a lot of things going on, and reactivity is a big deal for me. And you can see over here on the right hand side of the guide, talks about eliminating those ignition sources. Again, remember, we potentially could have a flammable atmosphere. So that's some issues that are compounding my reactivity problem. And then lastly, for my priorities here in question 1 are the environmental protection piece. Again, as an ops level responder, there's not a lot that I can do with the spill. I can get out in front of it. I can divert this material. There are some things I can do, but actively up there in that hot zone, not much I can do. Spill and leak control is just not something that I can actively do. Neutralization is outside of my scope as an ops level responder. So the environmental piece, I got a fairly narrow lane that I can stay in here, but I still am concerned about contamination. So question 2, what will be your initial actions on arrival? So let's pause the video here, talk amongst your team as to what those initial actions may be for you. All right, question number 2, what will be your initial actions on arrival? For me, quick emergency decon of that driver. Remember, I told you that's my top priority. I've got a driver who's exposed. He's been in the back of that trailer where there's a confined area. He's potentially been exposed to corrosive, toxic vapor. I've got a lot going on here, so I want to decon him as quickly as possible. Top priority. And you see here the guide does a really good job of giving us some guidance there. It says, for corrosives, in case of contact, immediately flush the skin or eyes with running water for at least 30 minutes. Secondly, as we discussed, that 150 feet in all directions, that isolation, that establishment of that hot zone, again, that decon of the driver and this isolation of 150 feet, this can take place in literally seconds. Getting these processes started can take place immediately after I arrive. This is not something that has to take me 20 or 30 minutes to do. I can get on those things really quick. For all of the things that we've talked about and all the hazards and all of the instability of this incident, I'm going to want a charged hose line on the ground. There potentially could be a fire situation if I don't isolate those ignition sources, and I may potentially have a fire situation. I want a charged hose line on the ground. Hopefully I don't have to use it, but it would be nice if we get into that situation. Again, isolation of those ignition sources. And then for me, and again, I told you this is based on an actual situation that we responded to, shutting down the ramp to the interstate and potentially dropping that trailer. So the question oftentimes comes, do I shut down the interstate itself, or at least maybe the nearest lane of travel? In the situation that we responded to, we did not shut down the interstate. There was enough separation there. We did shut down the ramp. There's no reason to have that traffic coming right up beside that trailer. Responder protection comes into play there as well. So we did shut down the ramp, did not shut down the interstate. Also, dropping that trailer, again, you got a $10,000 trailer and a couple of $100 worth of freight on it, but it's hooked to a $100,000 road tractor. Can we save some property here by simply detaching one from the other, pulling the road tractor down, 50, 100 feet away, so that it's protected? If we have the resources to do that, I wouldn't put that contaminated driver in there. If we have the resources to do that, whether that be cleanup company, whether that be somebody in the response community, whatever, if we have a way to do it where it's safe, that would be a consideration that I would take as well. So question number 3, what treatment does the ERG recommend for our exposed driver? Again, let's pause the video. Let's talk about what your policies say for treatment and what your level of medical response capability is. All right, so what treatment does the ERG recommend for our exposed driver? So let's look at page 150, which is the general first aid. And Guide 154 is going to point us here. So our general first aid considerations, you see up here at the top, ensure that the medical personnel are aware of the materials involved and take precautions to protect themselves and avoid contamination. The last thing we want to do is hand off a contaminated patient to an EMS service and then contaminate their ambulance. If they don't do the right thing, we've done the wrong thing if we do that. If they don't do the right thing with the next step, and that's taking that patient to the hospital, if they don't ensure decontamination before they get into the hospital setting, then we've shut down the emergency room at the hospital. And we can solve all of those problems, and we can eliminate that domino effect by doing good decon on the scene. That's what that patient needs anyway. Let's do the right thing on the scene, and we don't contaminate and create problems for our partners downstream. Back to the scene though. Move the victim to fresh air if it can be done safely, administer oxygen, those kinds of things. We're going to treat those symptoms that the driver's having. But you see here in the middle of the page, probably the most important piece here for me, remove and isolate contaminated clothing. Remember the rule for contaminated clothing. Up to 90% of the contamination can be removed simply by removing the contaminated clothing. So that way we only have a fraction of the contamination that remains on the skin. We can't do much about the inhalation. We can't do much about what's soaked into the skin, ingestion, those kinds of things, but we can eliminate it from getting any worse. That exposure to the body getting any worse. We remove that contaminated clothing, get that flushing started, and you can see here, I've got it circled, the general first aid guide talks about a 20-minute flush. That's a generic whatever you're exposed to 20-minute flush, where Guide 154 says 30 minutes. So that's a little bit contradictory. I'm gonna lean toward Guide 154 because it's more specific to sodium hydroxide than the general first aid is. I'm gonna go with that 30 minutes. So when we see a discrepancy like this, let's remember what we're talking about. Guide 154 and that 30-minute guidance is talking more specifically about the material that we are dealing with. And then the last one that I've got the arrow here, the effects of the exposure, whether they be inhalation, ingestion, or skin contact, to the substance may be delayed. This is important to remember, that if I don't see immediate signs and symptoms, but we know that that person has been exposed, I need still to get that decon process going really, really quickly because of this element right here. Those signs and symptoms can be delayed. If we get out ahead of it, we potentially can mitigate or lessen the intensity of that exposure if we go ahead and act early. The longer we wait, the worse those symptoms are going to be. Remember, in our scenario, he's getting worse by the minute, and that can be expected. In the actual response, the driver was hiding the exposure from us. He didn't tell us that he had tried to upright the drums. He didn't tell us he had been in the back of the trailer. He was hiding all that from us until he couldn't hide it anymore. He mostly just had it on his hands, but he'd also been using his phone, so he had it on his ears. His phone was contaminated. His ears were burning. They were blistering his hand. He couldn't hide that after a while. So it started getting much, much worse, and that's when we realized this guy had been lying to us and hiding from us. But we still, of course, went down the appropriate roads for decon, but we could have lessened that if he would have been honest with us up front and we got a little more aggressive a little earlier. Question number 4, what are your other long-term considerations? So let's pause again. This is our last question, so let's pause and talk about in our groups what our kind of wrapping this up, getting toward the end of our response. What are we talking about here? What are some of the things that we need to consider? So question 4, what are the other long-term considerations? Again, for me, monitoring for those reactions. I told you early in the video that the reactions, they worry me. That's one of my big considerations, my big worries for this. And we talked about some of the things that can happen. The reaction with the wood, with the metal, a lot of other factors there. But it's important to remember that reactions are going to build, when they're confined, they're going to build pressure. In this situation, hopefully not a lot of pressure being built because our containers are open. We're in an open space, although it's confined to the trailer. We're still in a fairly open space, relatively speaking. So pressure shouldn't be a big deal, but we can expect heat to be generated. So what can I do there? Thermal imagers, temperature guns, those kinds of things that we use in the firefighting side of the house oftentimes can be kind of double tasked for this type of duty. Can we get back outside of that 150 feet? Can we look into the back of that trailer with that thermal imager, with a temperature gun? Can we look at the outside of the trailer from those distances? Can we monitor that heat production? Yes, we can. That's not a bad strategy. Damming and diking, we talked about that. Again, staying out of the product, getting out ahead of the product, diversion to put that product where we want it to go. There's a lot of things that we can do there. The book talks about covering the material with dry earth, with sand, and those kinds of things. There's a number of things that the book recommends. So let's also talk about considering a technician level team. There's a lot going on in this response, and there's a lot of things that can be done that are outside of my scope as an ops level responder. I need a technician level team to do some of the things that we've been talking about. Spill and leak control, potentially neutralization, and some other things. We definitely need to consider a technician level team. You'll see here on page 4 under the safety precautions, and I would highly recommend for any hazmat response, anytime you use the book, and whether you're looking up things in the yellow, the blue, or the orange pages, page 4, the safety precautions are a great place just to stay grounded. I really like what the book does here. It's a good reminder for any level of responder. But if you'll look down here under the obtain help piece, basically what it's talking about here is if you've got a lot of things going on that are outside your scope, consider the next level of response level. In this situation, that's going to be a technician level team, or it potentially could be a technician level private entity, a cleanup contractor, something like that. So there's just really good justification for taking it up to the next level and getting the assistance that you need. But here on page 5, the notification and request for technical information, it's very important for us to know and understand what those local, regional, state, and maybe even federal requirements are for reporting an incident. And this is not complicated. It's just a matter of reaching out to those partners and understanding the process and following the process. And that oftentimes can get us into the pipeline for additional resources and for additional manpower and additional expertise. So they kind of play hand in hand with each other. Hey, thanks for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Again, this one was a little higher in intensity and a little higher in complexity than our first one. And the next one you can expect to be a little higher even still. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell to get notified of additional content. We'll see you next time.